Let's travel back 2,000 years and see what a real ancient Greek home looked like. Where did people eat, sleep, argue, and relax? Step inside with me as we explore the rooms of a typical ancient Greek home, revealing a world surprisingly different, yet strangely familiar. Ancient Greek houses weren't just piles of bricks. They were carefully designed spaces reflecting a complex society, its values, and its strict social rules. Forget sprawling mansions for most. We're talking structures often built from simple sun-dried mud bricks or stone, held up with timber beams using the classic post and lintel method you see in their famous temples. Roofs were typically covered in terracotta tiles. Now, picture walking down a street in ancient Athens. The houses would look rather plain from the outside, often sharing walls with their neighbors. Windows were few and small, high up, primarily for privacy and security rather than letting in light or air. It was a world turned inwards. Out in the countryside, however, things could be quite different. Wealthier rural estates might boast gardens, orchards, and even pens for animals, a clear sign of the owner's status and connection to the land. But how big were these homes? Well, that depended heavily on when you lived and how much money you had. Back in the Archaic period, around 800 BCE, a typical house might only be 50 to 70 square meters. That's pretty small, maybe the size of a modern one-bedroom apartment. But fast forward to the classical period, the time of Plato and Pericles in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, and affluent families could live in homes exceeding 250 square meters, sometimes even with a second story and specialized rooms. This growth tells us a story about increasing wealth gaps and the growing importance of showing off your status through your home. So, what was the most important part of these homes? You might be surprised. It wasn't a grand living room or a fancy entrance hall. The absolute heart of the ancient Greek home, both architecturally and socially, was the aule, the central courtyard. Imagine an open-air space, usually positioned on the south side of the house to catch the precious sunlight. This wasn't just an empty patch, it was the bustling center of domestic life. Often you'd find a central altar, perhaps dedicated to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and home, or Zeus Herkios, the protector of the household enclosure. Daily prayers, small offerings, libations, these family rituals happened right here, reinforcing their connection to the gods and each other. Need water? There was likely a well or a cistern sunk into the courtyard floor. In fancier homes, colonnaded walkways called peristyles might surround the courtyard, offering shaded areas perfect for escaping the Mediterranean sun. And what happened in this crucial space? Pretty much everything. While richer homes might have had a dedicated kitchen, many families cooked meals right here in the courtyard, perhaps using portable braziers or a simple hearth. Women gathered here, supervising children, spinning wool, and weaving textiles, essential tasks for the household economy. It was the main stage for daily life, open to the sky but enclosed within the family's private world. But Greek society was strictly divided along gender lines, and their homes reflected this dramatically. Forget open-plan living. Certain areas were strictly designated for men and others for women. This separation is one of the most defining features of the Greek house. Let's start with the men's domain. One of the most famous and often exclusive rooms in a wealthier Greek household was the andron. This was the men's room, quite literally. It was strategically located, usually near the main entrance of the house. Why? To limit the contact between the women of the household and any male visitors or outsiders. The andron was the setting for the legendary symposium. Now, don't just picture a wild frat party, though there was plenty of wine involved. A symposium was a more structured drinking party, a cornerstone of male social life, involving philosophical debates, poetry recitals, political discussions, and musical performances. The room itself was designed for this specific purpose. Guests wouldn't sit on chairs. They'd recline on cushioned couches called klinai, typically arranged around the perimeter of the room, often slightly raised on a platform. The host usually occupied a central or strategic position. These rooms were often the most decorated in the house, sometimes featuring elaborate mosaic floors with geometric patterns or mythological scenes, and painted frescoes on the walls. It was a space designed for male bonding, intellectual exchange, and reinforcing social hierarchies, strictly off-limits to the women of the house when in use for these gatherings. So where were the women? The women's world was centered in the gynaikon or gynaikonitis. These were the women's quarters, typically situated in the more secluded parts of the house, often at the rear or even on an upper floor if the house had one. Access was usually restricted, sometimes only possible through private corridors, emphasizing their separation from the public-facing areas and male visitors. What happened here? This was the hub of female domestic activity. You'd find looms for weaving cloth, a vital contribution to the household economy, chests for storing linens and valuables, and space for raising young children. This was seen as the domain where women managed the internal affairs of the home. Now, older interpretations sometimes painted the gynekon as a kind of isolated harem, completely cut off. More recent research suggests it might have been a bit more flexible. Women likely oversaw other areas like storerooms or even kitchens, depending on the household. However, the fundamental social segregation remained. The gynekon represented the private, domestic sphere managed by women, distinct from the male-dominated, outward-facing world represented by the andron. So, beyond these gendered spaces, what other rooms kept the household running? Let's talk about the functional heart, the kitchen or magirion. In homes that had a dedicated space, it centered around a hearth. Smoke wouldn't go up a neat chimney like today, but would often vent through a simple opening in the roof. Imagine the smell of wood smoke mingling with cooking food. Utensils were practical: clay pots for stews and boiling, bronze cauldrons for larger tasks, and flat griddles for cooking bread or fish. The diet was generally simple but healthy, revolving around the Mediterranean staples: olives and olive oil, grains like barley and wheat, often eaten as bread or porridge, lentils, vegetables, and fish. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions. Remember, in smaller or less wealthy homes, cooking might not happen in a separate room at all, but rather out in the courtyard or in the main living area, sometimes called the oikos. Adjacent to the kitchen, or perhaps near the courtyard, you'd find the storerooms. These were crucial for the household's self-sufficiency. Inside, you'd see large ceramic jars called pithoi, capable of holding substantial quantities of essential supplies, like grain, olive oil, and wine. Keeping these staples safe and dry was vital. Somewhere nearby, you might also find a workroom area. This could be where grain was processed, a tough, laborious job often done by slaves or female family members, grinding it into flour using a saddle quern, basically rubbing one stone back and forth over another. These workrooms weren't just for food prep. They could also be spaces for crafting, where textiles were finished, pottery was made or repaired, or even simple items like sandals were produced. These rooms highlight how the Greek home was often a unit of production, not just consumption, meeting its own needs, and sometimes producing goods for local trade. They were the hidden engines powering the household. What about where people slept? Bedrooms, known as thalamos, were generally quite simple and sparsely furnished. Don't expect elaborate decorations in most sleeping quarters. The main piece of furniture was the bed, typically a wooden frame with ropes stretched across to support a mattress, which might be stuffed with wool or reeds. While the master bedroom, often belonging to the head couple of the household, might occasionally feature some painted plaster or even a simple mosaic, functionality usually trumped ornamentation. Privacy was the key. Where did slaves sleep? Their accommodation was usually even more basic, often small rooms located near their areas of work, like the kitchen, storerooms, or stables in rural settings, furnished with only the bare essentials. And personal hygiene? Did they have bathrooms? Well, yes and no. Plumbing as we know it didn't exist. However, wealthier homes sometimes included a small, dedicated bathing room, the balanion. This might contain a terracotta tub. Think of a large, sturdy pottery bathtub. Water wasn't piped in. It would have to be heated over the hearth in pots and then carried to the tub and poured in using pitchers. It was a labor-intensive process. For the vast majority of ancient Greeks, bathing likely involved simpler methods, using wash basins, perhaps in the courtyard, or making use of public bathhouses, which were common features in Greek cities and offered a more communal bathing experience. So, stepping back, we see how the layout wasn't accidental. Urban homes in crowded cities like Athens often built upwards, placing the gynekon on a second floor to maximize limited ground space. Rural estates, unconstrained by city walls, could spread outwards, incorporating functional buildings like stables, olive presses, and larger gardens. The design reflected the environment. And while perhaps less ornate overall than public temples, homes weren't devoid of decoration. We've mentioned mosaics and frescoes in the Andron. Throughout the house, you'd find the iconic red and black figure pottery used for storage, dining, and drinking, often depicting scenes from mythology or daily life. Geometric patterns were popular, especially the famous Greek key or meander motif, thought to symbolize infinity or the eternal flow of life, a design element still popular today. In conclusion, the typical ancient Greek home was far more than just shelter. It was a carefully structured environment, a microcosm of Greek society itself. The central courtyard fostered family life and religious observance. The distinct separation of spaces like the andron and gynaikon rigidly enforced prevailing gender roles and social hierarchies. Functional rooms like kitchens and storerooms underline the importance of household self-sufficiency. From the simple mud brick walls to the symbolic altar in the courtyard, every element tells a story about the values, beliefs, and daily realities of life in ancient Greece. Even today, echoes of these ancient designs persist, perhaps in the courtyards of Mediterranean architecture. The concept of separating public and private spaces, or the enduring appeal of neoclassical decorative motifs. By peering into these ancient rooms, we don't just see architecture. We glimpse the narrative of human lives lived thousands of years ago, reminding us that the spaces we inhabit always reflect who we are.